Shabbat Shalom. As Eli mentioned in his words, tomorrow night is Holocaust Day. Last week, the Illinois Holocaust Museum, which is actually the third biggest Holocaust museum in the world, issued the following statement. For the last 6 months, Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center has repeatedly warned of the undercurrent of anti-Semitism within the discourse on the Israel-Hamas conflict. Then it continued and it said, "We are in a moment of grave crisis, and bad actors are using the cover of free speech in this moment of tension to normalize dangerous ideas that can cause real harm to Jewish students and communities. We call upon the world to be vigilant and reject each instance of anti-Semitism, even as we support freedom of expression. The work of the Holocaust survivors who founded this museum reminds us that we must heed the warning signs from history and be willing to work together for a transformed future." And so I didn't have to wonder what statements or dangerous ideas they were talking about, because the news is full of all of it. And so many, but just last week, people have been quoting, saying horrible things about Israel, about Zionism, and about Jews in general. And I'm thinking about the comments of the protest leader of Columbia University, who said, "Be grateful I'm not going to get rid of all the Zionists." And so others are saying, well, what does it mean to normalize it? Well, others are saying, well, he didn't actually mean it, and he took it back, and it's not as bad as you think, and some of it is bad, but some of it is good, and this is normalizing very disturbing behavior, and it wouldn't be accepted if it was any other group. And the same day, there was an article that came out by Yair, interviewing Yair Lapid, who's the head of the opposition in Israel. And he said he was very open and straightforward, as Israelis sometimes are, for good and for worse. And he said, we're growing very frustrated that we always have to play the victim games and make ourselves into the biggest victims to be seen. He wrote, "I'm done being a victim. I'm done being a victim since June 1945. So the thing is that now, in order to get sympathy and the empathy of the Western world, I have to remind them every 5 seconds that we are the victims." And he expressed disappointment, and I'm paraphrasing him, in the intellectuals of the West who are now willing to bring some moral complexity in understanding a horrible and tragic situation that's been befalling both sides of this conflict for 100 years, and no good solution or easy solution is to be found. And the truth that one can be pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel in the same way, but that there's not everyone, but there's a current of those who would turn Israel, and by extension Jewish people, into convenient boogeymen for all of the ills of our world. And so Eli finished his Dvar Torah with the Holocaust, and tomorrow this commemoration of Holocaust Day. People sometimes oversimplify what is the message of the Holocaust. Because the Holocaust, on one hand, yes, was a message about how easily nations and human beings become oppressors. And for the Jewish people, there are other lessons too. One lesson was that nobody came to our defense, and so a need to defend our own selves. And there's also a message there about another universal lesson about what happens when human beings let their passions overcome them, and reason disappears, and then that's when disaster happens. And of course, this is when there's nationalistic passions, and when it's fear of others take hold, but also when passions for a certain kind of justice can also lead people astray into destructive and harmful behavior. And so the story that we've been reading in the Torah all these weeks, Acharei Mot, in Hebrew, which means after the deaths, the story we mentioned earlier that comes after the death of the stories of Aaron, Moses' brother, when the freed Israelite slaves had gone into the desert and God gave them a command to build a temple in the desert, a great temple sanctuary made of tents. In the middle were the 10 Commandments and the Ark. And then the service was inaugurated in grand fashion by Aaron. All the worship was began. And at the end of all of this, Aaron's sons suddenly got carried away. And the Torah says they themselves rushed into the tent where there were restrictions because the 10 Commandments were there. It was so holy and powerful. And they offered the commandment that God had not commanded them in, and they passed away. And the understanding is that they weren't able to understand what the situation was. They didn't understand the consequences of their actions. And only Aaron and Moses were allowed in the tent at that point. And the holiness had to be approached with a certain amount of inner peace and deliberate actions, and not in this rush. And so they let their passions carry them, and it resulted in this terrible tragedy. And so our parsha then goes on to explain, how does one actually approach something in this serious? And they say, well, one has to approach with all this care and intentionality, with the proper knowledge, with preparation and integrity. And perhaps something, not all, but something of this issue can be applied to what has been the biggest story for the last few weeks, what is happening with the students in these encampments, and many in the movement. And most of them are very well-meaning. They're looking for an identity, a cause to believe in, and they feel passionate about a people's suffering. But unfortunately, they've also lost perspective or sense of reality and truth, and they are not looking into the real-life situation and ignorant of the forces of work that are also pushing them into this direction of behavior and activity. And we might say that Aaron's sons also in their own way were looking for identity. They were now important priests, son of the high priest. But they didn't really know who they were. And they saw their father doing his worship at the temple and be the high priest. And they said, we want to find our own place within all of this. And they thought that bringing an offering without telling anybody would be their way of finding their place within all of it. And for these students, they're searching for meaning, and others are providing them with a whole outlook and way of looking at it, an outlook that fits with how they've been taught to see the world, divided between oppressed and oppressor, colonized and colonizer. And they're rushing in with all of their passion and not putting the necessary energy and time to really finding out what is the history, not just on one side, but on both sides of this conflict. And what forces are they allying themselves when they're expressing kinship with Hamas and with the horrific harm that the side that they're identifying with has and is causing. And of course, there are many differences with our parsha. It's an imperfect analogy. The protest movement, in another way, is more like a mob mentality, and that can happen to all sides. When we are in big groups, we tend to get swept away by groupthink. And so there are important differences, but at the same time, they're also akin. In both situations, great passions are loosened and causing people to speak and think and act in ways they would ordinarily never do. So Eli, I've been thinking about the togetherness that you spoke about so beautifully in your speech. And that's what helps people navigate situations like this of great crisis and danger, wars, and this crisis of anti-Semitism and the violent student protests. And that togetherness and peace, togetherness in trying to find mutual understanding of both sides, of all sides, and to bring about shalom, peace. And the word shalom in Hebrew really means wholeness. Rabbi Natav Nemerov says, what is wholeness? Bringing two opposites together, not trying to destroy or crush one of the sides. And the passion for togetherness and peace that you spoke about is not try to overpower or silence others through violence or intimidation. It's about a passion that works through joy and kindness and that much slower and steadier work of being a force to repair and bring healing and truth and empathy and justice for all people. And I know that you and your peers strive for that goal. And I bless that you will achieve that lofty goal despite all the obstacles and not finish the work until it is concluded. Shabbat Shalom.